Welcome to the Marketecture Podcast. We have a special emergency episode in reaction to Google's announcement that they will not be getting rid of third-party cookies. I am joined by a special guest today who I thought would be quite insightful on this topic, Andrew Cassale, friend of the pod, CEO of Index Exchange, and former guest on this pod. So, Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, I mean, I don't know. It's 4 o'clock Eastern when we're recording this. Have you started drinking? You have the scotch by the side of your desk here, or is it just the engineering team and product team that's hitting the sauce?
I think we have a slightly different take than the third party cookie is getting its day of execution. Like if you read between some of the lines and there's a lot of details that are not quite clear, this does read like almost nothing is changing with the exception of some not yet determined user experience that will inject a workflow into Chrome that will put the user in position or put the user in the power position of the availability of the cookie, which could in turn effectively lead to the deprecation of the cookie for the majority of opportunities. Therefore, yes, definitely into the sauce at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I do not think that the industry is getting a state of execution
Okay.
here.
Yeah, that's very insightful. I probably should have started with what we know. So Digiday and several other entities have published pieces that obviously were informed by Google. They all talked about a Google blog post, but I haven't seen this Google blog post. But I imagine in keeping with Google's habit, the blog post will say absolutely nothing. But effectively what was announced was that they're not killing cookies abruptly, like as has been the current plan, which has been delayed multiple times. Instead, they're going to offer consumers some new insights and tools, unclear what, to manage their privacy better. And they're going to, at the same time, continue to develop the sandbox. So, is it the best of both worlds or is it the worst of both worlds? I guess would be my first question.
Yeah, like I think to me, in any of these circumstances, you have to look at active precedent, and I think active precedent that I would look at would be one of either Safari or iOS. This is obviously not Safari because Safari just opted out, or I should say, defaulted to third-party cookies being off. But if you look to iOS, which sounds very similar to the consumer choice narrative in the blog post referenced. iOS and the app tracking transparency framework effectively now has a prompt coming up to every consumer upon every app that says ask app not to track or allow. If you imagine a Chrome version of that across the open web, I think you can also then imagine comparable ask app not to track or maybe ask app a website not to use cookies as an input from the consumer, which could have us losing 70, 80% of the availability of the identifiers. Only instead of Google deprecating a third party cookie, they'll be empowering the consumer to do it. And so I would say, again, details are scarce. We do not know what design they're going with. There is a high probability that we are going to still lose the vast majority of third party cookies unless there's a very, very novel new design that we don't have an active precedent for.
Yeah, that's well said. And that's sort of my take also is that they'll either help consumers to block the cookies universally. I hope they don't do site by site because that would just be such a pain in the ass for consumers if they get a little alert on every single site they go to asking if you want to allow cookies. But whatever it is, this is a cookie deprecation by another method rather than what the headline says, which is that they're just not getting rid of cookies.
Yeah, I'd like to believe it's gonna be browser wide, but I put my money on websites, and I know it'll be annoying, and it will be annoying, but I think that'll be the move because of the precedent from iOS. You have to imagine if they only ask you once per website, the vast majority of the websites that you visit, you'll provide your consent or your opt-in in day one and never be asked again. And then you're down to just a long tail. And it allows for that trusted relationship between the end publisher and the consumer. But my bet would be it will be per website. We'll see. Obviously, we don't know yet.
And what we learned from the ATT rollout is that the wording and the timing and the rules around that opt-in, opt-out are very important. In the Apple case, what they controlled the wording very strictly. They had rules that said things like you're not allowed to incentivize the consumer to opt in by giving them different content or different capabilities. And the one thing you were able to do was to control the timing of when it showed. We don't know anything about that. We're totally speculating, but you can imagine a very wide range of opt-in, opt-out rates depending on how Google approaches this problem.
Yeah, big time. But I think there's actually one additional wrinkle, which is in the iOS environment, same with Android, we have the MAID, the IDFA, which is sort of a shared language between every participant in the targeting, tracking, attribution chain. On the web with third-party cookies, we don't really have that. We have a fabric stitched together by domain with pseudo-anonymous identifiers across each domain that get matched. And I think the wrinkle here is going to be if the consumer goes to the publisher's website and says yes, if the consumer goes to Nike.com and says yes, they're never going to ad tech. So it also is just not clear to me how they're going to solve the challenge of like, is indexexchange.com authorized to use a cookie, for instance? This is a more complicated scenario. So again, very keen to understand the exact specifics because they're not even going to be duplicative to the iOS or the app environment.
Right. So this all is within the context of regulation and oversight. So the UK group, the CMA, has been effectively the regulator of the sandbox rollout, and their last report, which was I guess like 4 weeks ago or so, was quite critical of the sandbox. It said sort of in a very polite British way that it wasn't suited to purpose, that there was numerous problems, and I remarked at the time that the problems they brought up, things like the fact that Google controls it, that it's not owned by a standards body, and that it could change in the future, were things that were very hard to fix. They were like fundamental problems with the sandbox. They weren't minor problems. And so, does this change, in your opinion? We don't know very much, but in your opinion, does this help their regulatory oversight? In that Sandbox is no longer the only game in town, so maybe it gets less scrutiny. Seems to me like it doesn't really change very much at all.
I don't know if the ICO has rendered an opinion on, the ATT framework from Apple, but, I have to imagine any design that puts the consumer first and in full control over everything would be viewed as pro-privacy. I also have to imagine any design that puts the power of choice in the hands of the consumer will be perceived to be inoculated from any perceptible anti-competitive conflicts. Therefore, I have to assume that the proposed, solution, would address both parties. But I don't know what it is going to be, but I think it would be safe to assume that it would be pretty hard to argue if the consumer is effectively controlling on a domain basis who has access to cookies. The consumer has now taken over the responsibility from Chrome.
Yeah, I think also there's a question about whether the CMA is really regulating the sandbox or whether they're regulating the removal of cookies within the sandbox context. And I think it's actually the latter. I think really their purview has been around whether Google should be allowed to deprecate the cookies. And so maybe this is a bone that they're throwing, or maybe that's a bad analogy. It's a way of sort of eliding the scrutiny because they're not deleting cookies anymore. But then that begs the question that, like, whatever they do in terms of this opt in or opt out or however they implement that, that whole process will now be subject to regulatory review, I would think.
I would think so as well, but that's where I would cite again the precedent from mobile, where today, roughly on the average, 30% of iOS traffic has an IDFA, 70% does not. You can argue that Apple did not deprecate the availability of the IDFA, but the vast majority of its availability has now been minimized. I think the same will be true here too, where if this choice comes to the end consumer and the consumers more often than not choose to not allow, we won't have a scenario where Google or Chrome are claiming to have deprecated the third-party cookie because it will be available, but it will be available the vast minority of the time. We'll see where that nets out.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying there. So I know it's early, but does this change your product roadmap plans? Index Exchange recently announced its testing results on the sandbox. Do you think you're going full steam ahead with the sandbox?
The vast majority of the dev work, to support, protected audiences and topics is done and dusted as far as index is concerned, and so there were, additional roadmap priorities that we had intended to work on in H2 that just, flesh out and clean up the design. It's probably gonna happen, irrespective of this news. Again, back to outstanding questions. The other outstanding questions that we would have is, what does this mean for the sandbox APIs? as in a world of tomorrow where the choice goes to the consumer, but we will now have mixed profiles of consumers that have some third-party cookies and some non-third-party cookie availability. Will the protected audiences API or the topics APIs always be firing?
Right.
In which case, will Sandbox still be sort of like this moat of the future that we can incrementally build our way toward with support from all audience? In which case, I don't really think this negates the value of investment. It potentially elongates the timeline before we have to have pure critical mass. But in short, the vast majority of the work has already been built.
Yeah, I think this dovetails a little bit with last week's document that was put out by Apple about the WebKit Privacy 2.0 or whatever it's called. And in that document, Apple criticized the sandbox pretty directly as a mechanism that increased the ability for consumers to be fingerprinted by providing additional data points. And you could make a very clear argument that is hard to dispute that if a consumer or browser has third-party cookies on it and you add topics to it, you're actually reducing the consumer's privacy versus the baseline. So I would hope, I would think that if third-party cookies continue in some subset of the traffic, that topics should not be allowed on those user sessions.
Well, it remains to be seen if topics and the topics design will pass scrutiny. I know the ICO has also provided commentary on it. Understanding the rotation of topics and the fuzziness around it, I would mildly push back on that assertion only because I think there's a significant amount of variability that any given Chrome browser will exhaust externally. The idea of using that amount of variability to create a fingerprint, I think, is a little far reaching, but certainly fair feedback. And again, I don't know if we know the end state for topics or whether or not it will survive all the tests to come.
Well, fingerprinting aside, it would allow you to add data to the user's profile. You have a user profile based on a third-party cookie. You get a topic, they're interested in finance, just add that to the profile. It's like free third-party data segments effectively. But I guess the last topic or general topics is, how does this make you feel? Like, do you feel like disappointed? Like this is such a mess. We spent so much time on it, or you seem actually kind of mature in this whole thing. I feel bad, but you seem pretty even-handed. Like, what's your emotional reaction to this roller coaster?
I think we've long held an assumption at Index that a plan B was an inevitable possibility. The plan B that we were most worried about was effectively Safari, which was we tried with Sandbox, it failed. Therefore, the open web gets the Safari design, which is the deprecation of third-party cookies with nothing else. This feels like something slightly better than that plan B eventuality, but something not terribly far away from it. So I guess I would say a lot of the emotional roller coaster side of this, I think we got through a few years back when the reality of the future of Chrome became apparent, which was we were not going to have the third-party cookie for long. Today, this just feels like Plan B is now in effect, and it's a slightly better Plan B than the worst case scenario that was anticipated.
That's well put. As I know you're from Canada, but as a U.S. citizen, it just feels so parallel to what we've been going through in the presidential election. I actually checked, and the date that they announced that Chrome was going to remove cookies was just 3 days before Biden was inaugurated. It was January 16th, or 4 days, January 16th, 2020. And now, the day after Biden decides to step aside, we have Google doing the same, and I don't know, maybe the analogy dies there, but it's like, it feels very much like a sort of a relief, and also we don't know what's gonna come next.
That's fair. It's also 3 days after strike knocked out 8.5 million Windows computers. So, yeah, we're living in a very interesting timeline right now.
Exactly. All right, Andrew, thank you so much for participating in this emergency pod.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right, now we're back. We have Paul Bannister, the Chief Strategy Officer for Raptive. Paul's been a innovator and a active participant in the Sandbox trials. He has a lot to say about the subject. So, Paul, how are you feeling right now?
It's a pretty wild day. I think maybe we'll look back at this and feel like it was maybe meant to be, but today it's definitely not what I was expecting.
So we don't know very much about what the announcement actually means, but what's your hot take on what it actually means?
I'm like cautiously optimistic. I've definitely heard like the doomsaying of like this is going to be like Apple ATT, where they're going to make it really hard for users to opt in and terrible. I think with CMA oversight and with ICO oversight to some level, as well as like sort of the intentions of the broader Google team, like I'm more optimistic that it'll be more like, the sandbox features opt in where it was like cool new ad privacy settings, like click here to accept. And like nearly everybody will. I mean, the reality is today you can already opt out of third party cookies in Chrome if you want. You just got to dig into it. And so I feel like, maybe this is like somewhat easier, but still not that easy.
So I had Andrew Cassale on earlier, and he painted a pretty dire picture where it was going to be like ATT, where it would
Mhm.
be like per website you'd be asked if you allowed third party cookies, and it would just be a mess. So you seem a lot more optimistic that it's going to be like a single dialogue with some sort of middle of the road kind of prompt.
Given how much money Google has put into the privacy sandbox game, I'm optimistic that some decent compromise will come out of it. And I don't think it'll be like ATT, but time will tell.
So, how does this change your investment as a company, as a product leader? Are you going to continue what you're doing, or are you going to wait and see?
I might wait and see a couple of weeks, just to see if there's some early indications of what's happening here. I don't think it's, immediately throw in the towel or triple down what we're doing. So I give a little bit of time here and see if Google has some information that comes out pretty quickly. I still think even in my like more optimistic view of the world, I think it's likely that more people will start opting out and therefore we start adopting features like this. So I think it's like you probably have to keep building. It just hopefully gives us more time and a little bit more like a user time frame.
Doesn't this kind of make our jobs as ad tech executives harder, because we were already having a hard time sort of convincing agencies and clients to take the no cookie world seriously, and they may read this as they still don't need to take the no cookie world seriously, while Chrome maybe goes from 90% cookied to 50% or 40% or 10% cookied over the next year or so, and the problem actually gets worse and no one does anything in a boiling frog kind of scenario.
It's funny because I actually think more of the issues in ad tech these days, like every freaking marketer website on the internet is overloaded with like, give me your email, 10% off, take this coupon, like, please do anything for me. Like, I feel like marketers are like so bought into like getting first party data and like activating it that way. And they use all that data for all of the walled garden technologies anyway. And so I feel like marketers are there. I feel like open web ad tech needs to get more behind all of this stuff and sort of using it more, not be so reliant on cookies. So I don't know, like, you but you're right. I think that this will definitely drag out the inevitable. I agree with that.
And what does the tech stack look like in a world where some significant minority of users have full third party cookie visibility, but a growing portion doesn't? Or do we move entirely to the no cookie world? Or do we use the cookie segment in some way to train the rest of the world?
I think we I think we're in a training world. I think we're in a multi-homed world where we've got 9 different tech stacks depending on what's going on. Like, I think about it from the publisher perspective, obviously, because that's what we do. And like, our stack has gotten more and more complicated, and I don't see this making it any easier. I think you got to deal with a whole bunch of different scenarios and and munge them all together.
What do you think the regulatory reaction will be to this?
As far as I understood, a lot of the major regulators around the world, like including like I don't know if it's the DOJ or FTC or whatever in the US, like agreed that the CMA could be the regulator of this process. And CMA had said that the ICO is a partner to them. So I think regulators are okay. Because also I think no regulator has said like, you gotta get rid of cookies. Like that's never been a statement. And so like I think people are like, okay, if the CMA approves this and is okay with this, like it's okay. But I cannot speak for regulators for sure.
Yeah, I guess the question is whether the CMA sees this as making the whole investigation moot, and that'll be Google's argument that we're not removing cookies, we're letting consumers remove cookies, which they always had the ability to do.
Well, and that raises another interesting point, which is like, if that you go down that path, does the CMA say, well, you don't have to worry about all these commitments you made either? And you can, and Google mothership can start blending Chrome data back into customer segments for Google only, and like all these other commitments that Google made. Like, does that get lifted? And like, hopefully not, but who knows?
Well, can you expand a little bit about that? So these are commitments that have been made in the past year or so?
Maybe 2 years.
Okay.
Like, I forget the list, but there's a list of 40 or 50 different commitments that Google made to the CMA of like, what they will do and not do. And like some of them are about how they will use data themselves. And I'm pretty sure some of them are around like data that Google gets in different parts of our business and how parts of their business and how it can influence how they can use that in different things of what they're doing. I may be wrong, but I think there are things in there that restrict their ability to use data across parts of the business that could be lifted depending on what happens here.
Yeah, it definitely throws the chips back on the table, and you start rearranging the arguments that you've been making. And you may say, or they may say, that the sandbox doesn't matter. The CMA, you shouldn't even care about the sandbox anymore because we're not removing cookies. You should care about the way we don't remove cookies or do remove cookies because that's what impacts your constituencies. But the sandbox itself is moot. That would be a pretty extreme position.
It would be pretty extreme. I mean, the position right now seems not to be that. They seem to be saying we're still investing heavily in the sandbox. We want to create new features and functionality. But that could definitely change over the next 9, 12, 18 months.
Well, yeah, I don't think there's any indication, especially from the statements, that they're going to not move ahead with the sandbox. I was making the argument that they could say to the regulators that the sandbox is no longer a critical competition issue because the cookies are still there.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's also like connects to the point of like who's making these decisions at Google, and like it's probably not the sandbox team or the ads team. It's probably like public policy, government affairs, like teams like that none of us know anybody at and are like playing a totally different 4-dimensional game of chess here.
Yeah, I was really wondering this too. And someone else texted me or DM'd me asking me this question, which is who's the ultimate decision maker? Because we know from Google statements that the sandbox team and the ads team don't talk intentionally. They're firewalled from each other. You have to go pretty high in the org before you have an executive that controls both of those teams, right? It might be at the Sundar level. I don't even know. So this whole thing, I think, is a pretty big black eye for Google on a reputation basis. A fairly ambitious program, delayed multiple times, runs into both customer and regulatory issues, still has not solved their ultimate competitive problem, which is that Apple kicks their ass on privacy messaging, and now is just thrown into chaos and limbo. Am I being too harsh?
I don't think you're being too harsh. I do think the one thing in there that might be the silver lining for them, because I've been thinking about this a lot, is the messaging point. Is there some way that they can weave the user choice thing into better messaging? I think it was you posted some meme or something on Twitter of like, the sandbox is like differential privacy and your anonymity is important, and therefore this is a good product for you, user. And like Apple's messaging is like your browsing is private. It's like, could user choice help them here? I don't know, but they've got a good marketing team.
Yeah. Yeah, they do to some extent. They're not allowed to say a lot of the things they want to say. So just to tie it up, so what's next for you? You're just going to wait and see?
I think we'll wait and see for a couple of weeks. Let's get some more information from them. The press release today is interesting, but not insightful. And then based on that, then decide what to do. And those defaults, like, is this ATT or is this sandbox products opt-in? Or where in between those points in the spectrum is a really important question that we all need to know the answer to.
Perfect. Paul, thank you so much for getting on this pod last minute, late at night. Appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to the Marketecture Podcast. New episodes come out every Friday, and an insightful vendor interview is published each Monday. You can subscribe to our library of hundreds of executive interviews at marketecture.tv. You can also sign up for free for our weekly newsletter with my original strategic insights on the week's news at news.marketecture.tv. And if you're feeling social, we operate a vibrant Slack community that you can apply to join at adtechgod.com.